Welcome to 7:30. Tonight we're devoting the programme to Australia's first referendum in 23 years, a vote on constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians through a voice to Parliament. You don't have to look further than the chorus of John Farnham's unofficial national anthem to see the task now facing the Prime Minister and the Yes case. You're the voice. Try and understand it, make a noise and make it clear. Polls suggest that hasn't happened yet, but what really counts is what happens next. Who has the momentum? There is a large proportion of undecided voters. How will they move once they better understand exactly what the voice is and what it's meant to do? Victory requires a majority of Australians and support from a majority of states. Tonight we'll hear from all of the states and territories, and then I'll speak with Laura Tingle to assess the politics on day one. We start in South Australia, where the Prime Minister launched the Yes campaign today. The state is home to 42,000 Indigenous Australians. It's also a crucial swing state. Adam Harvey reports, and a warning to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers, the programme contains images and voices of people who've died.
Good morning. We're just encouraging a yes vote to Parliament. Thank you very much.
How's the vibe been here this morning?
Good, really good.
At Adelaide Railway Station, the campaign is on.
I'm voting yes.
The leaders of the Yes campaign are here for the announcement of the referendum date, in a state that's critical to national success.
Where South Australia goes, Australia goes. If South Australians vote yes, we will win this referendum.
Numbers and history brought them here.
You know, people think Whitlam started land rights. No, Don Dunstan started it here in South Australia. But also, he was the first to appoint an Aboriginal governor.
Pastor Sir Douglas Nicholls is Noel Pearson's hero.
We're sitting on the shoulders of giants like him.
In March, South Australia legislated its own voice to Parliament. Kaya Ma is the state's first Indigenous Attorney General.
We would have loved to have had that set up and running to show that there's nothing to lose, nothing to fear from an Aboriginal voice to Parliament.
After a request from Indigenous elders, the state voice has been postponed until after the national vote.
It would have been a very unfortunate thing if a body to listen to Aboriginal people didn't take to account the voices of Aboriginal elders about when the election should be held.
So that gives you information.
The campaigners have 6 weeks to make their case.
It's about listening. That's what the voice is about. It's putting a requirement on politicians that they listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when they make laws and policies about us.
Do you feel like you know enough about the voice?
Not really, no.
No, I don't think it's been spoken about enough.
What's your understanding of what the voice is?
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't think there's been enough information about the whole thing.
At Adelaide Railway Station, it's tricky to find anyone who says they'll vote no. You have to go a little further afield.
I do think people are nervous about being honest about where they stand. I think there is some degree of bullying and ostracisation of people for having any view other than yes. It's been made clear by the big corporates, by celebrities, that this is something that any good person should support.
Liberal MP James Stephens thinks the case for a voice just hasn't been made.
I think there's a lot of risk associated with it. There's a lot of unintended consequence, and there are a lot more practical things we can be doing to help the plight of disadvantaged Indigenous Australians.
Noel Pearson believes the practical thing to do is to vote yes.
The country is finally ready to take that last step to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of Australia. And it is going to be a transformative moment. It'll be a new chapter for the country, and I'm so looking forward to it.
Now to Western Australia, where Indigenous people make up 3.3% of the population. Early debates about the voice in WA have been dominated by tensions over new laws to govern the protection of Indigenous heritage sites, laws that were introduced and then quickly dropped. The state is also home to the largest native title settlement in Australia. Rhiannon Shine reports.
Australia's biggest state has a coastline stretching thousands of kilometres. From the cold and rugged Great Southern, home to the Menang Noongar people, to the red dirt of the Yaru people in balmy Broome. WA is home to more than 60 different Indigenous languages and more than 100 native title determinations.
Incredible diversity, the desert people, the water people, salt water, fresh water. So we've got that mix that we have to consider.
Former Liberal MP Ken Wyatt was the country's first Aboriginal Minister for Indigenous Affairs. He quit the party over its opposition to The Voice.
We have so many issues that we have to deal with, and we are given an opportunity in a lifetime.
Western Australia returned the lowest yes vote of all the states in the 1967 referendum. Polling in the state ahead of this referendum has been mixed, mostly showing low support, but the sample sizes have been small.
I think it's knife edge for WA at the moment, but I'm hoping that in the last 3 weeks of the campaign, what we see is a shift as people engage, as people start to say, what is this about, what do we need to do?
Both the yes and no camps have been campaigning heavily in WA. The referendum is turning old foes into friends and galvanising crowds.
We have a 1,000-strong crowd and a waiting list of WA Liberals who are standing up to Mr Albanese, are standing up to Canberra, and they are saying no.
In the nation's mining capital, battles for land rights have been hard fought. The Southwest Native Title settlement between the Noongar people and the WA government is the biggest in Australian history. It came nearly 30 years after Mabo.
When the Mabo decision was handed down, I was with the state premier who said, there goes our backyards. Nobody under the Mabo decision has lost their backyard.
But some state laws are still failing to protect Indigenous heritage.
We know our people have been walking this land for many years.
New legislation that was designed to prevent another Juukan Gorge fiasco was scrapped just recently, following backlash from landowners who feared they'd lose rights over their property.
It's impacted Australians negatively. It's impacted, I think, certainly the support for the yes vote here in Western Australia.
WA has the highest Indigenous incarceration rate in the country. Suicides among Indigenous Australians continue to rise, despite millions invested. There is no shortage of issues to tackle across this vast state. The question now is whether a majority of West Australians think The Voice is the solution.
And if we fail, then I'm not going to give up. What I'm going to do, along with many other Indigenous leaders, is still fight for the changes that we need.
Leaders of the no vote, Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price and Noongar Warren Mundine, chose Tasmania to launch their campaign. There are 30,000 Indigenous Australians in Tasmania, 5% of Tassie's total population, a larger figure than in some other states. Tasmania could prove to be one of the decisive states in this vote, which is why Price and Mundine used it as their platform to denounce the proposed constitutional change. Will Murray is our reporter in Tasmania. Will, we just said it's a small population, but what will be the decisive issues that A Voice would address?
Well, Sarah, issues like access to housing and education are major problems here in Tasmania, but perhaps the starkest focus of A Voice to Parliament would be addressing incarceration rates. Similar to what you heard from WA, Tasmania has serious problems when it comes to rates of Aboriginal incarceration. Aboriginal Tasmanians are nearly 7 times more likely than non-Aboriginal Tasmanians to end up in prison, and the situation seems to be getting worse. So between 2012 and last year, the number of Aboriginal Tasmanians in prison more than doubled. And the situation in youth detention, Sarah, is quite similar. So Tasmania only has one youth detention facility, and over the past few years it's never held more than a few dozen detainees. but a huge proportion of those are Aboriginal kids, far more than you'd expect when you factor in that the population, the Aboriginal population in Tasmania is, as you mentioned, only 5%. So many people are advocating for Aboriginal-led solutions to those problems, and I think The Voice will help do that.
So, we've said already that Tasmania is very possibly going to be a pivotal state. The early feedback is that the vote is very close. Now, we're going to say a number of times in the programme that it's early days, but is that right, that the vote is sitting very close at this beginning stage?
Yeah, it's perhaps particularly difficult to know here in Tasmania because a lot of the national polls leave the state off, and the national polls use a very small sample size from Tasmania, so they're always fraught with danger, but they are indicating that it is very close. And we know that both the Yes and No campaign believe that Tasmania is very close, and as you mentioned, it's considered a battleground state. So far, the indications are that it's roughly around 50-55% yes, but that is very early days. The Yes campaign believe that they have a majority of supporters in the south of the state, but they say that up in the north and the northwest, it appears that at the moment there's a lot of work to do to get people to vote yes. So we'll wait and see, Sarah.
OK, well, you've got a situation there where you've got very prominent Liberals who are backing the yes case. What impact does that have?
Yeah, Tasmania is unique, is the only Liberal government in the country, and Tasmania's Premier, Jeremy Rockliff, is an ardent supporter of the Yes campaign, says he'll support the Yes vote throughout this process. We've also got very prominent federal MPs like Liberal MP Bridget Archer from up in the north and Senator Jackie Lambie, who are supporters of the Yes vote. Again, it's very difficult to say what impact their support is having, but certainly speaking with people who are from the Yes campaign, like the First Nations Referendum Working Group, they think that having broad spectrum support, so support from leaders from all political parties, is certainly an advantage to them.
Will, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Hobart.
Thank you.
Queensland is a big state with a large Indigenous population. Nearly 30% of the nation's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live there. Once home to Eddie Mabo, the Torres Strait man whose battle for land rights led to the nation-changing Native Title Act in 1993. The city-country divide is keenly felt at the ballot box here. 70% of the state has a Liberal or National representative in Canberra. Stephanie Zillman reports from Brisbane.
In the Republic referendum of '99, Queensland recorded the highest no vote in the country. It's a state that's reared great Australian First Nations heroes, from Neville Bonner to Cathy Freeman. But the Queensland government was the last to give Indigenous Australians the vote in state elections in 1965. Under the state's so-called Protection Act, Aboriginal workers had their wages given over to the state, and there were restrictions on where First Nations people could live. It also fought Eddie Mabo on land rights.
We've got to remember that the Mabo and Wick decisions were very unpopular in parts of Australia, particularly in Queensland and particularly in regional Queensland. And it was one of the reasons why Pauline Hanson's One Nation could get such traction.
When it comes time for Queenslanders to cast their votes on The Voice, the state's large Aboriginal population, the second highest in the country, is not necessarily an indicator of support.
We often speak that there's 2 Queenslands, but in fact we might say there's up to 6 Queenslands. The downtown centre of Brisbane and the inner suburbs vote very differently from the outer suburbs of Logan or Ipswich or the Moreton Shire. And southeast Queensland votes differently to the provincial cities like Townsville and Cairns, and they vote very differently to the western districts around Mount Isa or Carnarvon.
At Mount Isa's annual rodeo earlier this month, some locals held concerns about the referendum.
Oh, well, I wish I knew more about it, but that's a good thing they try to put a stop to it, but that's a good thing that they fight back for it.
I know that there has been some disappointment in community for nobody actually coming out and talking to people, nobody going into the river and having a chat to people and making them feel heard, helping them understand, which I do worry will have an impact.
It's a no. definite no. Everyone should vote the same.
It's a sentiment that could prevail.
If the polls are telling us that Queensland's going to register a no vote of 50-something% or even 60-something%, I think we can take that to the bank. I think it's pretty certain that Queensland will vote no on this referendum, and I suspect that Queensland will probably register the highest no vote in the country.
With 6 weeks to go, there will be information sessions at community centres and churches, as well as rallies to come.
It's fair to say that Queensland was probably very slow coming to the table of servicing First Nations rights, but certainly there has been much catch-up. And indeed, we're talking about truth and reconciliation in First Nations affairs in Queensland. So Queensland has tried very hard to catch up with the rest of the country.
In Victoria now, where 65,000 Indigenous Australians live, that's just 1% of the state population. There's a long history of activism and progressive policy. A First Peoples Assembly established in 2019 represents Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the state. Nadia Daly and Nicole Asher explain how it works and ask whether a national voice might look similar.
Annette Shebris is a Wurundjeri elder who lives on a rural block in Lara, about an hour southwest of Melbourne. She set up what's called a yarning circle. It's a place where people get together and talk. When it comes to the voice, there's a lot to discuss.
Well, I'll be voting no. I still don't even know what it is, you know. When you ask, they say we'll get that first and then we'll work out what we're going to do second. And until they can tell us how the voice is going to be structured, how it's going to be implemented and how it works, I'm hesitant to vote yes.
She's worried that even if a voice is successful, Indigenous people won't have any more power in their decision-making than they do now.
So to me, it doesn't really sound like a voice from the people. To me, it's just like we're rubber stamping.
Annette is part of the Black Sovereign movement. She knows that across Australia, the Indigenous voting population is small, and it's the overwhelming majority of non-Indigenous voters who'll decide the referendum.
It's not up to the Aboriginal people. We're probably 1 or 5% of the electoral ballot. So what say have we got there? It's not up to us. It's not our choice. It never has been. It's the government's choice.
But in inner-city Melbourne, Ruben Berg has a different view. He's a Gunda Jamara man and the co-chair of the First Peoples Assembly, a democratically elected group representing Indigenous people in Victoria.
Do you mind if we put up one of the signs? Of course. I mean, yes. I think we're kind of leading the way here in the nation of ensuring that we do have this elected representative, the voice of First Peoples, to be able to progress these treaty conversations.
Here in the suburb of Fitzroy, one of Melbourne's original heartlands of Indigenous activism, Ruben and his colleagues are drumming up support for the yes vote.
And so to have that voice in the Constitution will be just one of the legacies of the amazing work of our people.
How will you convince people to vote yes?
I think the message for me is to keep telling people that the majority of Aboriginal people do support the voice, that it will bring positive outcomes for our people, and that it will bring our nation together. It will unify our nation and enable all people to celebrate in our culture. And I think those are things that everybody can agree to, I would hope.
In the 1967 referendum on Indigenous Australians, Victoria had the highest yes vote in the nation. And now polling predicts it's one of the few states to have a majority yes vote for the Voice referendum. In 2019, Victoria established the First Peoples Assembly. It's working towards negotiating a statewide treaty with the Victorian government, which they hope will grant them more decision-making power in the future.
It is really important that if the government is going to be making decisions that directly affect us as a people, we should have a say on that.
The referendum vote in the Northern Territory, like the ACT, will be applied to the national vote. Remember, each side needs a majority of votes nationally and a majority of states to win. Nearly 26% of the Territory's population is Indigenous, by far the highest proportion in the country. The presentation of the Statement from the Heart calling for a voice happened in the Northern Territory at Uluru in 2017. Lillian Raingear joins us from Darwin. Lillian, what's going to be important to voters in the NT, Indigenous and non-Indigenous?
Well, some of the most severe gaps in outcomes between First Nations and non-First Nations people exist in the Northern Territory, particularly in terms of the health of First Nations people and over-representation in the justice system and in incarceration. So these issues will likely play on the minds of a lot of voters, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. At the same time, the NT has also been at the forefront of a lot of major land rights movements, from the Wave Hill Walk-Off to the Yirrkala Bark petitions and, of course, the Barunga Statement. So there's a really strong connection to country and culture amongst a lot of First Nations people in the Northern Territory. For some, English might be their third or fourth language because language is so alive in the Northern Territory. So a lot of people will be wanting to protect the connection to country that Indigenous people have here as well.
So, Lillian, tell me, what impact does it have that Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, that she's from the Northern Territory? What impact will that have?
Well, her impact is really quite enormous. The Country Liberal Party in the Northern Territory has committed its rank and file members to a vote against the Voice to Parliament, and it's easy to see that Jacinta Price would have played a large part in that. And now even the Country Liberal Party, who holds the opposition in the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly, their leader, Leah Finocchiaro, has also expressed that she will be voting against the Voice to Parliament as well. So for sure, Jacinta Price's influence will be felt throughout the Northern Territory.
And Lillian, just briefly, what's the impact of the law and order issues we saw so publicly during the course of the last 12 months?
Well, they've left a lot of residents in the Northern Territory quite scared and afraid that, they might be targeted by crime. And for some people, they've associated this debate on crime around the Voice to Parliament. So that means for some people, they're worried that a Voice to Parliament could make representations to relax crime laws. And there's been quite vocal opposition to any effort to do that. But at the same time, consultation with Indigenous leaders plays a really strong part within the justice system in the Northern Territory. So it's, as an advisory body, that is something that the Voice could potentially be set up to do, consult with First Nations leaders. So it's hard to say whether the crime debate will have a uniform impact on the votes of people around the Territory in this referendum.
Lillian Raingear, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And now to New South Wales, home to the largest Indigenous population in the country. It was the place first colonised by the British and where terra nullius was declared, entrenching the derided legal principle that the land belonged to no one. And it's the only state yet to begin a treaty process. Jason Olm is in Sydney.
Sydney's Redfern is famous for the Aboriginal civil rights movement. From protests and struggle to Paul Keating's landmark Redfern speech.
We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers.
Donna Ingram grew up around Redfern and remembers attending Aboriginal rights rallies as a girl, but how the neighbourhood has changed.
And this is where I feel my cultural connections are. It's all shiny and
yeah,
new,
I mean, look, this used to be the block. It was still the block, but not as I know it, not as I knew it.
Yeah.
Donna will be voting yes.
Obviously, having it in the Constitution, it can't be changed, because I think Aboriginal people deserve to have a voice and be heard.
But she says some in the community have their doubts.
One of the big ones is people feel that sovereignty will be ceded. I think another big one is distrust of government as a whole, for obvious reasons.
If the polling is correct, Australia's most populous state could be headed towards a no. The No campaign held its official launch in Western Sydney, population 2 million.
I think it's particularly important here in Western Sydney. I've argued that as a nation we shouldn't be divided, We shouldn't be creating separate classes of people in this country.
No campaigner Warren Mundine has told 730 they're focusing on migrant communities, tradies and the working class. Former federal Liberal candidate Pradeep Pathi is a volunteer with the No campaign.
Want some information about the voice? It's risky. We multiculturals, when we come here, we see one thing, that is everyone should be equally treated. Why can't we use the present infrastructure and the resources to utilize a betterment of fixing that gap rather dividing the nation? More information about the voice, which is risky and unknown.
Western Sydney and the outer suburbs have lots of undecided and swinging voters in marginal electorates. Many Pradeep hopes will vote at the last minute.
Last 1 week is crucial. That's the time before the polling. That's the time they're going to take a decide.
And they're the voters you want to influence?
That's the voters, it's important for us.
Have you made up your mind about how you're going to vote?
Not really. I kind of like the whole idea, but there's too much that I don't know about.
As we said at the beginning, the polls leading up to this point are much less significant than what happens next and which side is able to develop real momentum. The political stakes are high. I'm going to bring in our chief political correspondent, Laura Tingle, but first, Laura's in Canberra, so we'll get her to talk to us about the ACT. Laura, how much penetration is there of the voice issues in the ACT?
I think it's pretty significant, Sarah. Polls are very hard to tell because Canberra is a relatively small population, but the Yes campaign says it has more volunteers per capita than anywhere else in the country, which suggests that it does have a penetration. And the ACT actually has, and has had since 2008, a voice-like body here in the Territory which talks to government, asks questions and gets some really simple and practical things done, like getting some housing for older people and a bus stop outside the Aboriginal Medical Service. So it's not an unfamiliar idea to Territorians.
Let's go to both sides of the campaign today. What did you make of both Albanese and the group in South Australia, as well as Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine in Tasmania?
Well, a few things that were interesting, I think, Sarah. The Prime Minister has been at pains to stand back from this sort of information phase of the lead up to the referendum. He led the announcement today with a very passionate speech. He concentrated on positive things. He didn't attack the other side. He concentrated very much just on the language of the referendum question and said that this was not a huge thing, and that he said to people, please don't close the door on the next generation of Indigenous people. So he was focusing very much on that and on saying that, on emphasising that the referendum question gives is a clear declaration of the primacy of the Parliament. Now, and he also said, going to the most vulnerable part of the Yes campaign, if you don't understand, please ask. Now, I think that there's a lot to go on that end of the debate. On the other side, I thought it was fascinating that Peter Dutton let the two Indigenous spokesmen speak first today. He came out very late. They were very interestingly attacking the Prime Minister and the Yes campaign quite aggressively. Warren Mundine accused Anthony Albanese of sort of racial abuse, and it was very personal, and also talked about the fact that this was an elite proposal that was going to be dividing the nation. I think one of the most interesting observations of the day, Sarah, actually came from the South Australian Premier, Peter Malinauskas, who said, if our great-grandparents can say yes to waves of migration, if our grandparents can say yes in 1967, if our parents can say yes to land rights, then this generation is capable of saying yes to an advisory committee. And I think the interesting part of that is the Yes campaign really has to find a way of getting that message across, that this is nothing really scary, that it's an advisory body, but there's always a great problem with that when you're at the same time saying this is going to be something that's transformational.
Now, to a federal question of federal politics, simply how high are the stakes for both sides now? I don't mean the Yes and No campaign, I mean for Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese.
Well, clearly, I think Peter Dutton and the Coalition sees this as something that can help really tear down Anthony Albanese's lead on the Coalition in the polls, and it's a pragmatic political judgment, and you can see that in their attacks on his attacks this afternoon, and in the attacks of the No campaign more broadly on the Prime Minister himself about this idea that he's being tricky, that he's keeping things hidden from the public. So this is a really crucial thing that the Prime Minister, all questions of the merits of the case aside, really does have to address. He does have to come out himself and be able to argue to people, look, this is what it's about. We're not being clever or anything. This is about making sure that the Parliament determines what the nature of the voice is, that it isn't something that's going to lead to all sorts of other things. And one of the big questions, I think, will be whether the campaign goes off, as it has in its unofficial stages, into issues that aren't in the referendum itself, like the question of treaty and other issues that No campaign has raised.
Laura Tingle, thank you very much indeed for joining us. The campaign for the Voice referendum begins in earnest now across the country. More than 30 years ago, Prime Minister Paul Keating said in the landmark Redfern speech, "More I think than most Australians recognise, the plight of Aboriginal Australians affects us all." However the debate unfolds in the next 6 weeks, however people decide to vote, that notion will surely have resonated with all of us. Good night.